Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 21090 in the name of Ben Macpherson on the Scottish Rate Resolution. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Ben Macpherson to speak to and move the motion. Minister, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today, the Scottish Parliament votes to set all rates and bands for Scottish income tax. This is our opportunity, together, to use the powers of this Parliament to continue our progressive approach to income tax. The Cabinet Secretary for Finance has written to the Presiding Officer regarding the procedural connection between this rate resolution debate and the budget bill under the Parliamentary Standing Order 9.16.7. This Parliament must pass the Scottish Rate Resolution before considering Stage 3 of the Budget Scotland Bill. Presiding Officer, today I am asking Parliament to set income tax rates which the Scottish Fiscal Commission forecasts will raise over £12 billion in 2020-21. This revenue will support the best outcomes for the people of Scotland and continue to deliver the fairest tax system in the UK at a time when Brexit is and will remain the biggest risk to the Scottish economy. In contrast to Brexit, our proposals for Scottish income tax offer certainty to Scottish taxpayers. We are proposing no changes to the existing rates in our income tax plans for 2020-21, as we continue to deliver the settled structure that we committed to for the duration of this Parliament. Presiding Officer, we are proposing to raise the starter and intermediate rate bands by inflation, as we did in 2019-20, and freeze the higher and top rate thresholds. Our decision to freeze the higher rate threshold again in 2020-21 is forecasted by the Scottish Fiscal Commission to raise £51 million next year. However, our decisions mean that on their current income, no Scottish taxpayer will pay more in 2020-21 than they are in 2019-20. Decisions on the personal allowance, of course, remain reserved to Westminster. And for the purposes of modelling, the Scottish Fiscal Commission have assumed that the UK Government will maintain their policy of freezing the personal allowance threshold at £12,500. However, this outcome is far from certain, again demonstrating the impact on Scotland's finances of a delayed UK Government budget, a UK Government budget that was delayed by choice, not by necessity. Presiding Officer, our fairer and more progressive income tax policy ensures that 56% of all Scottish taxpayers will pay less income tax than they would if they lived elsewhere in the UK in 2020-21. And our income tax proposals continue to deliver on the 4 key tests we introduced in 2017. 1, to protect the lowest paid taxpayers. 2, to create a more progressive arrangement. 3, to raise additional revenue to maintain and promote Scottish public services. And 4, when taken in conjunction with our spending plans, to support the Scottish economy.
Fraser.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. Just on the subject he's just mentioned, the issue of raising revenue, I wonder if he might reflect upon the scrutiny that's been provided by SPICE, which indicates that the £650 million extra being raised by the Scottish Government's tax changes are only delivering a net benefit of £46 million to the Scottish economy. Does that not suggest that the approach being taken by the Government does need to be rethought?
Minister.
Thank Murdo Fraser for that intervention. However, just to point out, as he mentioned in his question, that there would be £460 million less for spending on public services. Key public services like health and education and justice and local government, all of which are important for the delivery of public services on the ground and meet some of the requests that the Scottish Conservatives made in the budget process. Moving neatly on to my next point, today I'm asking the Scottish Parliament to agree the Scottish Rate Resolution motion, which for the tax year 2020-21 will raise for our budget funds to deliver, as I said, the widest range of free access public services in the UK. Initiatives that promote inclusion and provide support. For example, concessionary travel for older and disabled persons, and now following our budget deal with the Greens for those under 19 years old. And importantly, progress towards achieving our ambitious targets on addressing child poverty through initiatives like the Scottish Child Payment. And of course, Presiding Officer, tax isn't set in isolation. For our public sector workers, we have guaranteed a 3% basic pay increase for all those earning up to £80,000. This means, as a result of our income tax and pay policy choices for 2020-21, a senior nurse will be around £890 better off in 2020-21 than this year, and a teacher will be around £950 better off in 2020-21 than they are this year. Presiding Officer, under this Scottish Government's proposals, there will be no increase in the tax divergence relative to the rest of the UK, as long as the UK Government stick to their commitments, the ones that they made in their 2018 budget. Back in 2018, the UK Government committed to freezing the higher rate threshold in the rest of the UK at £50,000 in 2020-21. The Scottish Conservatives have asked us not to create more divergence, and our proposals will ensure this. Divergence will only increase if the Conservative UK Government decide to once again deliver a tax cut for high earners. What's more, Presiding Officer, regardless of what the UK Government do, the benefits of having access to the widest set of free public services in Scotland outweigh any income tax differential with the rest of the UK. In conclusion, under the plans put before you today, Scotland will continue to be the lowest tax part of the UK for the majority of income taxpayers for the third consecutive year. We have continued to deliver a Scottish tax system that offers convenience, fairness, efficiency and certainty for Scottish taxpayers, for the Scottish people. Our decisions on taxation have resulted in a more progressive tax system, protecting low and middle income taxpayers, while raising additional revenue to invest in public services and Scotland's economy. I present to you today a Scottish rate resolution motion that will deliver a fair and progressive tax system, raising £12 billion for the Scottish budget to protect and enhance our vital public services and support our economy. That is £12 billion towards increasing well-being, tackling climate change, reducing child poverty, and increasing sustainable and inclusive economic growth. Presiding Officer, I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much. I have a little time in hand this afternoon for interventions across the afternoon, so or a little bit flexibility with speeches. Now call Donald Cameron, our Conservatives. Mr Cameron, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I begin again with words of welcome, this time by welcoming Ben Macpherson into his new role as Minister for Public Finance and Migration. And in much the same way as past discussions between myself and the Cabinet Secretary for Finance have been conducted, he and I have likewise had many constructive conversations since our respective election to this Parliament in 2016. I look forward to continuing that positive dialogue with him. And I welcome the opportunity to open for the Scottish Conservatives today, but regret that yet again we stand here faced with a Scottish rate resolution which continues to make Scotland the highest tax part of the United Kingdom. And I remain disappointed that despite the talks that my party had with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, our request that the government guarantee no further divergence should the UK government make any changes next week was ignored. Now, whilst many hard-working people across Scotland will no doubt be relieved that the tax hiking, levy-raising tendencies of this government have been silenced for this year at least, the freezing of the higher and top rate thresholds will mean, as has been said by one analyst, that at a time when earnings growth is over 2%, that means in Scotland, more people will be sucked into paying more tax. And many will rightly ask why it has happened in the first place, given the cast-iron promise of the SNP in their 2016 manifesto, when they said that we will freeze the basic rate of income tax throughout the next Parliament to protect those on low and middle incomes. And as my colleague Murdo Fraser pointed out in this very debate last year, the comment he pointed to from the First Minister in 2017 when she told Parliament, I've been very clear that the government will not increase income tax. That is not true. It is another promise broken. But, yes.
Cabinet Secretary.
Just in the spirit of keeping promises, does the member accept, though, that the Chancellor did promise to freeze the higher rate threshold next year? So if there is to be any more divergence, it's because he's broken his promise, not because this government has taken any decisions.
Donald Cameron.
I don't accept that, but it is perfectly possible for the UK government next week to make changes. And all we sought from the government in our negotiations was a commitment to match that should changes happen. But, Presiding Officer, there is a deeper problem. 1 year on from the SNP's big shake-up of the Scottish tax system, we now know that the grand idea hasn't quite paid off, because despite crowing about hiking up taxes for middle earners, it turns out the Scottish government hasn't raised anywhere near the amount it will have wanted to make to ensure that it is worthwhile. These higher tax revenues, according to Spice, are forecast to be almost entirely offset by the deduction to the Scottish budget via the block grant adjustment. And they cite, no, I'm keen to make some progress, and they cite the Scottish Fiscal Commission forecast, which estimates that this £650 million differential will only generate £46 million more than is deducted by the block grant adjustments. And Spice go on to say, for around half of Scottish taxpayers, income tax devolution has meant higher tax bills, but no additional spending power for the Scottish budget. No additional spending power for the Scottish budget, running to stand still, in other words. Now, I wouldn't dare to suggest that £46 million isn't, in and of itself, a considerable sum of money, but it amounts to less than 1/5 of 1% of the total Scottish budget. And that is certainly something that I would ask the Minister and the Government to reflect upon. And there lies another much starker peril for this government in the near future, namely budget reconciliations for income tax receipts, because the Fiscal Commission note in its February forecast that based on these forecasts, the reconciliation for 2018-19 income tax to be applied to the budget next year, 21-22, would be a negative £555 million. In other words, the SNP are facing a black hole of over £500 million in next year's budget. So if you take the total this year, next year, and the year after, that is close on £1 billion of money to be found. And of course, this year, for the very first time, Deputy Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government are using their resource borrowing powers to address this. But given this government are already maxing out Scotland's credit card when it comes to capital borrowing, by borrowing the maximum amount of £450 million per year, it would be remiss not to mention the potential severe implications for the next few years. And as others have noticed, and I think this is a point made by Bruce Crawford last week, this makes budget management between years all the more important. And Spice have said that based on the information we have to date and the evidence that the balance of the reserve has been falling in recent years, it would seem from these plans that the Scottish Government is not building up large reserves to mitigate the large expected reconciliations in the years to come. And that is deeply worrying, and I hope the Minister and the Cabinet Secretary will address it as a matter of urgency. But despite this gloomy picture, Presiding Officer, there is some light at the end of the tunnel. The UK Government spending plans will see the Scottish Government's block grant increase by nearly £1.6 billion in real terms compared to last year. And that's a figure acknowledged in the draft budget by the Scottish Government, whose estimate of consequentials is almost £500 million in excess of the Treasury's own estimate. Thanks to the UK Government, a typical taxpayer in Scotland is now £1,205 better off than they were in 2010 due to the cumulative tax changes to the personal allowance, amongst other things. That is because, unlike this government, we know that taxpayers are best placed to decide how their money is spent, and not the SNP. It is undeniably clear that the UK government has been able to keep more money in people's pockets and still invest record amounts of money in our public services, which Scotland is plainly benefiting from in terms of consequentials. Presiding Officer, I began by talking about how people in Scotland are paying more tax, but can I end by stating that that's not just about income tax, but it's also about council tax. Because as a result of failing to find £170 million of capital investment sought by COSLA, many councils are now regretfully having to implement council tax rises of almost 5%. Another promise broken. Deputy Presiding Officer, in the same vein as last year, we cannot support this rate resolution. because despite our reasonable request to guarantee no further tax divergence with the rest of the UK, that has been rejected out of hand. And for those reasons, I urge Parliament to oppose this motion today.
Thank you very much. And I call on Rhoda Grant to open for Labour. Ms Grant, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too would welcome Ben McPherson to his new role. Last year, we saw the SNP government introduce a rates resolution that gave high earners a tax cut, but increased tax to some of the lower earners. Instead of righting this wrong this year, they've simply continued it. From the foundation of the Parliament, we had tax raising powers. In the very first parliaments, they were modest and they were never used, but that was as much due to the high investment from the Labour government in Westminster as it was to the financial management of Labour, the Labour-led government here. Child poverty was falling, educational attainment was rising. Presiding Officer, those were the days. Then it all ground to a halt with this incompetent SNP government, a government that between 2007 and 2011 got their budget through on Tory votes. And that tells you all you need to know about their fiscal policies. It was also the SNP government that never intended to use tax-raising powers, the SNP government that handed back the ability to use them. We now have an SNP government that demands independence, but is much too timid to tax the rich. Last year, they cut taxes to the better off when they should have increased the top rate to 50 pence. Again this year, they're too timid to do this. Children are growing up in poverty and they're too timid to ask the rich for a few extra pence to prevent that. So much for the brave new world. They call for independence, but they forget the deficit. They forgot that the economy is not built on the generosity of 1 or 2 billionaires. It's built on all citizens having a job, earning enough to pay their taxes. And they have ushered in policies that put tens of thousands of public servants to work. In any other industry, Presiding Officer, a pace would have been set up. And I'll take the intervention now.
John Mason.
At the same time, I thank the member very much for giving way. But does she accept that while we can have income tax slightly higher than England, if we go too far ahead, there is the danger of behavioural change?
I don't believe, unless you were to change taxes dramatically, that you would have behavioural change. But the behavioural change that would happen is we would have money to invest in the services that we very much need. And that's what we are calling for. Because the only way actually to deal with a deficit is to build the economy. And the SNP often say they don't have the levers to do it. But of course they do, because they use them to make us worse off. If they had used these levers to bring down the deficit and build the economy, we might make some progress. Yet, for independence, they depend on an unpopular Tory government to make a negative argument rather than using the powers they have to make a positive one. They use the politics of grudge and grievance rather than the politics of investment and growth. How could anyone trust them to negotiate independence? They negotiated a fiscal framework that leaves us 200 million worse off this year and creates a £1 billion black hole over the next 3 years. Under this government, the only thing that is growing is poverty, educational standards are falling, and the NHS is one long waiting list. Our councils are no longer able to provide lifeline services for our communities. And can anyone remember the historic Concordat? How it was heralded as the new relationship of mutual respect between government and councils. Councils must rue the day that they ever fell for that one. The Concordat now means that they're only able to provide statutory services, and they struggle to do that. And if that was not bad enough, their council taxes are also being set here in Edinburgh by the Scottish Government. Let me quote Jim Hunter's comments on the budget last year, and they still hold true today. Ministers and MSPs can keep councils on the tightest reins. And when services in consequence get slashed, they can arrange for councillors to take the blame. Perhaps the time has come for councillors to quit council chambers, lock the doors and mail the keys to Holyrood. Since you guys insist on calling all the shots, their covering note should say, it's high time you carried the can. This year's rates resolution heaps more misery on our councils that are already failing to provide public services, and it provides no hope for improvement, just cuts upon cuts. And this is a political choice. This government talks left of centre politics, but in practice it is a right-wing, tax-cutting, service-cutting government.
Thank you, Ms Grant. And I call on Patrick Harvey to open for the Greens. A little time in hand, Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I don't think that the greatest fan of this government's rate resolution or indeed Rhoda Grant's attempt to demolish it altogether, I don't think either of these extreme positions are genuinely honest. I think there have been very important progressive changes through devolved income tax, and I also think that we could and should go further. I think we also are all aware, Presiding Officer, that so incompetently was the last Scotland Act drafted that if this Parliament doesn't pass a rate resolution, the result will be nothing less than a catastrophe for public services. And on that basis, as we did last year, the Greens will abstain, allowing the rate resolution to pass, but not allowing it to pass without comment, certainly. And the comments that I'm going to make are based on the recent paper from the Fraser of Allender Institute on the impact of Scottish Government tax changes on household incomes. That paper integrates what we know about income tax changes by UK and Scottish governments with what we know about what's happening in other fiscal measures like local taxation and social security. It shows very clearly that the UK changes to the personal allowance, this notion of constantly increasing the personal allowance, is a deeply regressive step. The highest income 5 deciles of the population see their income boosted by a larger percentage than the lowest income deciles. And the Resolution Foundation has shown that 3/4 of the cost to the Exchequer of that increase to the personal allowance goes to the highest income half of all households. 1/3 of the cost goes to the richest 20%. And of course, the poorest in our society gain nothing at all, not a single penny from that increase in the personal allowance, because their incomes are already underneath it. If we then add in the progressive tax change from the move to the 5-band system, as the Greens alone proposed in the 2016 election, and I'm pleased that the Scottish Government decided to change its position. I welcome it when they break a bad promise, and maybe they did that. The Green position in 2016 has, broadly speaking, been implemented, and it is the single element that makes the overall income tax changes progressive. It does save relatively little for low-income households, but it means high-income households are paying more, and the combined effect of those changes to rates and bands with the personal allowance still shows that we've overcome that injustice that would have come from the UK changes of seeing a greater benefit flow to the wealthy than to the rest. We then have to look at how it integrates with local taxation changes. And again, if we'd only seen the above-inflation increase, that would have hit hardest on lowest income households in Scotland. But we also saw changes to the bands at E to H, and when we combine those effects, the overall impact is that, yes, everyone's paying a bit more on their council tax, but it's high-income households who tend to be paying more. Put those two effects together, the income tax changes and the local council tax changes, and we still see that the combined effect is that high-income households are paying more on average and low-income households are protected. Some are better off, but all of that first 5 or 6 income deciles are protected from the overall effects of those tax changes. And still, at this point, the single biggest element achieving that progressive effect is the move to a 5-band system of rates and bands on income tax in Scotland. Now, I don't think that's enough to alleviate poverty and inequality. And unlike some, I do say that redistributing wealth should be one of our objectives when we set taxation and other policies in our economy. Income tax on its own is probably never going to be a powerful tool for improving the financial situation of the lowest income households, because the lowest income households already pay very little in the way of income tax. And so if we want to go further on this, if we want to achieve more, we have to look, for example, at council tax reform. And I encourage, once again, all political parties, including the Scottish Government, to show greater imagination, creativity and boldness in the council tax talks than we've seen to date. Because unless we do redress that fundamentally regressive aspect of council tax in our tax system, then whatever income tax policy we pass when we have our annual rate resolution debates will only be mitigation. Finally, Presiding Officer, we then, once we look at income tax and council tax, need to think about how that integrates with the other benefits through social security services and other services. And we do see a positive impact from changes that have already been made, and there'll be more to come with the Scottish Child Payment, which is yet to be put into force, and it will help more. But it, as we discussed in question time a few minutes ago, is still linked to UK benefits with persistent problems of administration and low take-up. So all of us, all political parties in this chamber, have a responsibility, not just today in passing a rate resolution to say whether we would go further, but as we develop manifestos over the coming year to put forward more policies that will cut housing costs, that will cut public transport costs, and that will create more benefits for people at the lower end of the income scale, because no income tax rate resolution on its own will be able to achieve that. If we want genuine redistribution, we need all of these levers to be used to their maximum effect.
I now call on Willie Rennie for around 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start off with agreeing with Patrick Harvey about the council tax reforms? We've got the cross-party group that's working on these proposals just now, and I hope the government does step up and actually come forward with proposals to end the council tax, because I think that's what we're all committed to, and I hope that is something that is seen to fruition. We've tried this many, many times in the past. Now is the opportunity to do it. There is a will, and therefore we need to find the way. This is an opportunity to test the various parties' positions on tax, as well as deciding whether we agree with the rate resolution today. The Liberal Democrats at the last election in 2016, we were up front. We said we should have what we described as a modest penny on income tax to invest in education. We were very clear with people that this is what you would get if you voted for us, and this is what we've argued for at various budgets in this Parliament. So we were pleased that the Scottish Government changed its approach, because at the last election, as Patrick Harvey has reminded us, they did not have that commitment, that promise in their manifesto. So therefore, I suppose it is a kind of a broken promise, and it's one that I'm pleased that they did revoke, but one that I think is they need to be careful with going forward. I think if you have got predictability about tax, if people know exactly where you are planning to go over the next 4 or 5 years, I think there is an element of trust that is developed, and therefore the behavioural change that potentially could come with other tax changes, with unrelenting tax changes, doesn't come to fruition. And that's where I think potentially the government has gone wrong, that not only increased the income tax, which is something that we were sympathetic to, but also on the council tax and other taxes as well. So I don't think there has been the behavioural change that some others were predicting, but certainly it's something that needs to be carefully nurtured to make sure that it doesn't actually happen. But this is a moment that we should actually reflect on the Conservative position on tax, because we've seen a screeching U-turn. The smell of burning rubber is still wafting round the chamber, because they made dire predictions repeatedly, relentlessly, that we're going to see massive behavioural change as a result of these income tax changes. Cataclysmic events, a massive reduction in the tax take, a big economic shock. That is what they said was going to happen. We're going to have an exodus south of the border with all these workers leaving Scotland. And the reality is something completely different. And we know why. It's because those changes have not happened. Yes.
Murdo Fraser.
Grateful to Mr Rennie for giving way. I wonder if he lives in a parallel universe from the rest of us. If he'd actually read the Spice briefing on the budget, he would know that the £650 million of additional taxation raised by the Scottish Government's income tax changes have delivered exactly what? £46 million, Mr Rennie.
Willie Rennie.
And if we had the Conservatives' way on this, that would be even deeper, because they are proposing a tax cut on top of that. So we would not be able to compensate for those measures that have come. And the idea, as Donald Cameron has suggested, that we have to deal with the reconciliations in future years by having more tax cuts on top of that will make the situation even worse yet again. So the argument does not stack up at all. So their predictions were wrong, and that's why we know in this budget negotiation they did not put forward any proposals to cut the tax, because they know the price would be so high, that the price on public services would be so deep. The cuts that we've seen to local government already would be even deeper. And that's why the Conservatives did not have the guts to put forward any tax changes in this budget negotiation. So they have been found out. Their predictions of cataclysmic events never came to fruition. So perhaps we'll see a different tax approach as we progress forward. But it is also worth reiterating our concerns about the capital overspends on certain projects across Scotland. The Sick Kids Hospital, the Ferries project, the AWPR, the Aberdeen Hospitals, the Our Power Energy Company with a £10 million loan. All these overspends are deeply regrettable. I'm sure the Minister herself regrets it and hopes that she can get control of these projects going forward, and that her fellow colleagues in the Cabinet are a bit more responsible in their planning of these projects in future. But it is difficult, not just now, but it is difficult to ask people to pay tax when the government is so irresponsible with these massive projects. It's costing us hundreds of millions of, not just now, it's costing us hundreds of millions of pounds. So that trust with the taxpayer needs to be repaired if we are going to make sure that progressive tax changes happen in the future. And with this government's reckless approach to its public finances, I fear that that might not be possible. So let's get control of the capital projects. Let's put an end to the arguments from the Conservatives that progressive tax changes result in cataclysmic events and behavioural change, the exodus down south. But also, let's make sure that if we are going to make tax changes, we have put that in the manifesto at the previous election, and we do exactly what we say we are going to do. Thank you very much.
We'll now move to the open debate and speeches of 4 minutes, please. I do have a little bit of time in hand to allow for interventions. John Mason, please, followed by Alexander Burnett.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I have to say I always enjoy a debate on tax. The first point I'd want to make is that income tax is a good thing. It has a lot of fairness about it, being linked to ability to pay, and it's also simple for employees, as their employers generally deduct PAYE before paying their wages. So many people do not have to be proactive in filling in forms or tax returns. At the same time, as Patrick Harvie says, it clearly cannot be the only tax, as it takes no account of property or wealth. For members who were at Time for Reflection yesterday, they would hear James Faddis from Bishop Briggs emphasising that people with addiction and related criminal pasts can and do change, giving himself as an example. And one of the folk he referred to had said that their aim in life, or one of their aims in life, was to pay tax. Presumably that was because if that happened, that person would be earning a proper wage and would have turned their life around from where it had been, and they would be contributing once again as a full member of society. And this is a reminder to us that paying income tax is a privilege. It means you're earning a wage, which many in the world are not, and you're contributing to wider society. Of course, it is also a duty, because you cannot have decent public services if you do not pay a decent amount of tax. Even the Conservatives say they want quality public services, but they undermine their position by saying they want lower taxes. I certainly support today's motion, and I think it was thanks to the Greens, as Patrick Harvey reminded us, that we moved to a system of 5 rates, which has helped it all to become more progressive. However, it has to be said that these rates are very much grouped at 19, 20, 21% and 41, 46%. I think in the longer term, I would like to see a system where the 5 rates might be something like 10, 20, 30, 40 and 50%. That would seem to be a fairer and more progressive system with less dramatic jumps between the stages. And on the subject of being more progressive, I think there is a strong argument for saying that national insurance is also a form of income tax. We could greatly simplify the UK system by combining them. National insurance is hardly progressive at all and is used, it has to be said, by Westminster governments of different persuasions to make hidden changes. And the rate of national insurance for the highest earners actually falls from 12% to 2%, the opposite of income tax. I would certainly like to see Scotland having full control of both income tax and national insurance and creating a much simpler system. The combined marginal rates at the moment are 31, 32, 33%, then up to 53%, then it falls back to 43% and 48% for the top earners. It's not a wide spread. Now, while on this subject, corporation tax is also a form of income tax, but for companies. There is a strong argument for corporation tax and income tax being at similar rates, and certainly both being corporation tax being devolved as well. This would reduce the opportunity for tax avoidance by people incorporating. And I do welcome the work that HMRC are doing on clamping down in situations where someone is really an employee, but attempts have been made to say they are not. Apart from anything else, employment generally gives better rights and protections than self-employment or incorporation. My final point would be that we remain in this situation where we are setting income tax rates not knowing what the UK ones will be. As long as we have devolution, we should be focusing on variations away from the UK rates, and inevitably these variations will be limited because of the risk of behavioural change. Yet it is impossible this year for us to do this properly as long as we do not know what Westminster income tax rates will be. So I do congratulate Kate Forbes and the Scottish Government for setting income tax rates while Westminster messes us around and keeps us in the dark. I look forward to debating this further tomorrow. Thank you.
Now Colin Alexander Burnett, to be followed by Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I note members to my register of interest as a taxpayer. As a representative from the north east of Scotland, I would be misrepresenting my constituents if I did not point out how damaging the disproportionate increases in council tax, business rates and income tax have been on our local economy in the recent years. And so it's utterly shameful that other constituency MSPs for the North East, all SNP, are supporting this budget, bringing further burden to local shop owners, teachers, firefighters, doctors, nurses, social workers, and pretty much everyone living in the North East. And these are not the big earners that the SNP likes to characterise in its annual attack on taxpayers. They are hard-working people who deserve better. Business, certainly, yeah.
Kate Forbes.
I just wanted to understand exactly what the member is saying in light of the fact that our headline poundage rate for business rates is lower than the rest of the UK, council tax on average is lower than the rest of the UK, and on income tax, can you provide me with any evidence demonstrating that someone has made a conscious decision to live elsewhere in the UK rather than Scotland because of our decisions on income tax?
Alexander Burnett.
Thanks to the Secretary for intervention. My point is that the North East has been hit disproportionately, and the buoyant years from the oil industry have left us with high business rates and high other costs of living up there, whereas wages and income has dropped, leaving us hit disproportionately. Now, business owners and investors cannot see why they are paying more than colleagues in England. And if this SNP government continues to penalise Scottish businesses for doing well, and then additionally penalise its workers, we will see a brain drain that deters investment and growth. And Scots should not be penalised for wanting to create business and contribute to their local economy. So the SNP, yeah, certainly.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful, and I recognise that we come from different political perspectives. He calls tax penalising. I call it a contribution to society. But does he not accept that under the income tax position in Scotland, it's only the highest earning decile, the highest earning 1 in 10 people who are paying 1.2% of their income more. Anybody lower than that, a fraction of a percent more that they're actually paying. This is a really modest change.
Alexander Burnett.
Thank you. I think whatever our differing political positions on the reasons for taxation, I think one we should agree on is that the purpose of taxation is to raise money to pay for our public services, which we all want. And if rates are put up disproportionately high and the total tax take goes down, then the money we have to spend on public services will also go down. So the SNP needs to listen to Scottish Conservatives and our sensible growth-focused budget request and reduce the large business supplement to the same rate payable in the rest of the UK. Because the SNP cannot say that they are acting for the Scottish electorate, because in 2016, nearly 65% of the electorate voted for parties that promised not to raise taxes. Yet this SNP government hiked them up, with anyone earning over £27,243 paying more in tax than they would in the rest of the UK. And I've had many of my constituents contact me asking why. Why are they seeing their taxes rise so significantly, yet receiving nothing in return? Why are they seeing local services deteriorate? And why are they seeing vital infrastructure literally crumble before their eyes? And the SNP has no excuse. Their block grant from the UK government has increased by more than £1.5 billion this year, and yet we find ourselves with local authorities across the country forced to increase their council tax by nearly 5% just to stay afloat. And with COSLA stating that local government funding as a whole has been cut by £200 million in real terms, it is putting local councils into a corner of slashing services, yet increasing their rates. And on top of that, new figures show that under the SNP, local authority debt has risen by almost 15% in just 5 years to an eye-watering total of more than 18 billion. Yes, 18 billion. So it is no surprise then that a recent report found that 62 bridges are due to be closed across Aberdeenshire by 2030. This will see hundreds of constituents cut off from their local communities and facing lengthy detours. Councils across Scotland are making drastic cuts to their SNP's imposed reductions on capital budgets, forcing local authorities to draw down on their reserves. And essential maintenance is now being cut, which will only result in greater costs down the line. As they say, a stitch in time saves 9, but the only people being stitched up here are the Scottish taxpayers. So the SNP government should hang its head in shame, because they've nobody to blame for those figures but themselves. They force these difficult spending decisions onto local authorities, whilst their own budget has been increasing. They have absorbed themselves from the responsibility of governing, and it will not be forgotten in May next year. Scotland deserves better. Thank you.
Tom Arthur, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you. Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to take part in this debate, and as it's my first opportunity to do so in the Chamber, I'd like to congratulate and welcome Kate Forbes and Ben McPherson to their new positions. I think, first of all, we have a responsibility in this Parliament, as much as we come from different political traditions, and nowhere is that often more obvious than when we discuss tax. We do have an obligation to be careful in the language that we use. I would like to perhaps just initially look at some of the rhetoric from the Conservative Party. One of the terms used is a middle-income earner. We sometimes see that in the front page of tabloid newspapers, and that a middle-income earner is someone perhaps on £40,000 or £50,000, and that this government has some sort of oppressive Dennis Healey-style set of policies which is going to precipitate a brain drain and leave Scotland crippled. That's the narrative, but it's nonsense. We all know it's nonsense. And we stand up and we engage in this pantomime, but we know it's not true. So let's just maybe try and establish some facts here. The median income in Scotland is £25,000, £25,200. In fact, 75% of taxpayers in Scotland earn less than £37,000. Now, someone earning £40,000 in Scotland is paying about £2.45 a week more in tax than they are in the rest of the UK. Think of a school teacher earning perhaps, I don't know, £42,000, for example. That's how much more they're paying a week. But unlike a school teacher in England, we're not sitting with £28,000 almost of tuition fee debt. So I think it's really important we get beyond this silly rhetoric Yeah, we can have a debate about taxation and its value and how it interacts with economic growth and what our objectives are, though that is somewhat difficult given the limited powers that we have. But let's just be reasonable. And I'd say to Rhoda Grant as well, you know, I appreciate there was a bit of nostalgia in her speech when Labour was in government and telling us how wonderful things were under Labour rule, failing obviously to admit the Labour policies that led towards the 2008 global crash and their light touch regulation in the City of London, which precipitated a decade of austerity. Something started initially. Oh yes, certainly.
Rhoda Grant.
I can't help but be slightly amused that the member blames a Labour government for a global crash. Were we so powerful? Maybe that's why poverty was falling.
Tom Arthur.
Well, I would just draw to a former party leader, Joanne Lamont, who described London as a city-state and a global financial centre, which was at the centre, in many respects, of the global crash under a Labour government light touch regulation. I'm not blaming Labour in isolation. That would be silly to do that. I'm just saying that they had a part, and of course it was Alistair Darling who said there would have to be austerity tougher and deeper than Margaret Thatcher. And that is the reality. This government was barely in power for 1 year when we had to, when the financial crash happened, and that has been the reality we've had to experience and deal with. But I think Rhoda Grant's comments about this being a right-wing government, it's ridiculous. I appreciate perhaps that the SNP might not be as left-wing as the Labour Party would like, particularly those acolytes of Jeremy Corbyn. But to go and suggest that it's a right-wing government, it's ridiculous. We need to up our game here and improve our rhetoric. This is a parliament of minorities. And there's been 5 years in the history of devolution when one party has had a majority. Other than that, it has been for Parliament to set budgets, it has been for Parliament to work together, and we have to raise our game. We have a responsibility to 5.4 million people, oversight of a budget in excess of £40 billion, and yet we're engaging in this daft, puerile rhetoric and deliberately misleading people with terms such as middle-end, what a middle earner is, or indeed, you know, what government is right-wing and what government is left-wing. So I think we have to go and take a slightly more mature approach. And I think there has to be a recognition that, and I'll make this my final point, Presiding Officer, because I realise time is against me. And the points raised, I think, by Donald Cameron and Murdo Fraser with regards to the income tax take in the fiscal framework. The fiscal framework is what we've got to deal with, but it is not sustainable in the long term. It is a perverse situation when we can raise £650 million in additional revenue via income tax, but only see £46 million of it available for public spending. But the reason for that is not due to a decline in Scottish economic performance relative to the rest of the UK as a result of that policy. It's because we can't grow our working age population, which underscores the need to grow our working population through migration. And I think it's excellent that the Minister for Public Finance is also the Minister for Migration, because that is going to be critical. Anyway, time is against me, Presiding Officer. Thank you.
Sarah Boyack, followed by Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to welcome the Minister to his new position. But in his opening remarks, the Minister said that no Scottish taxpayer will pay more. And I want to take issue with that, because we all know it's not the full story. The SNP government could use their income tax raising powers to make up the gap in the budget, but with their lack of ambition and tinkering around the edges, they're simply running to stand still. The bans in today's resolutions are not fair. Someone paying £44,000 is paying the same level of tax as somebody on £100,000. How can that be fair? And I would really meant to celebrate the fact that those earning less than £24,000 will pay 36p a year less, while at the same time, the SNP have outsourced their difficult decisions to local councils, who are forced to raise council tax to offset SNP cuts, and people on the lowest incomes will see their council tax rise. I do want to welcome Citizens Advice Scotland's campaign this week to raise awareness of the existence of council tax discounts and exemptions and their straightforward online tool which helps people find out whether they are entitled. We need to make sure that everybody who is entitled to that reduction actually receives it, because new statistics this week show a further fall in those claiming the exemptions they're entitled to. So we need action here. The reduction in people claiming council tax exemptions fails against a backdrop of £7 million of council tax, falls against a backdrop of £7 million of council tax debt across Scotland. It's the leading form of personal debt and is about £3,000 per person, 3 times the average council tax bill. So there's not much to celebrate here. Instead of raising the money our society needs from those most able to afford it through the levers that they have at their disposal, the SNP are instead relying on a tax they know is regressive. And I want to share the comments of Willie Rennie and Patrick Harvey at the disappointment in the lack of progress of the cross-party working group to abolish the council tax. We need to make faster progress because council tax is regressive, it takes little notice of a person's ability to pay and relies on a 30-year-old valuation of the property they happen to live in. After 13 years of underinvestment in local government by the SNP, councils have little choice but to raise their council tax and to increase charges. So while on one hand, the SNP government would like us to celebrate the tax we have in front of us today, this tax resolution, the reality is that people on low and middle incomes are going to be paying more for their council tax and they're going to be paying more for increased charges, whether it's for increased charges on music tuition or on collection of their garden waste. So, Presiding Officer, there is little to celebrate today. This motion is a missed opportunity and it's more smoke and mirror because it doesn't actually address the fundamental opportunities that could have been done today. It's a missed opportunity and it's nothing to celebrate. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Gordon MacDonald, followed by Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the fact that by setting this year's Scottish rate resolution, Scotland will remain the lowest tax part of the UK for the majority of income taxpayers for the third consecutive year. Just to be clear, no Scottish taxpayer will pay more income tax in 2021 than they did in 2019-20, and 56% of Scottish taxpayers will pay less income tax in 2021 than if they lived elsewhere in the UK. These statistics were confirmed by the Tory Scottish Secretary of State, Alistair Jack, in answer to Scottish questions a couple of weeks ago. To put this all into context, a police officer starting out his career in Scotland not only earns more than his English counterpart, he or she will also pay less income tax. A newly qualified nurse on Band 5 earnings will be the highest paid in the UK and be paying less income tax. Presiding Officer, over the last few years, we have introduced a more progressive income tax system than elsewhere in the UK. But we could do more. I've only got 4 minutes. But we could do more, a lot more, if the setting of personal allowances, national insurance rates and the income tax levels on dividends and savings were devolved to this Parliament. We ask that those that can afford it, like ourselves as MSPs, to pay more. This helps us to deliver a wider and better funded set of free-to-access public services which are not available elsewhere in the UK. One very recognisable example is prescription charges, where south of the border they will rise to £9.15 per item from April, effectively a Tory tax on poor health affecting millions. In Scotland, we have chosen to make sure that medication is free for all. By passing the rate resolution today on income tax, we can pass the budget at stage 3 tomorrow and protect the £589 million increase for local government, protect the extra £60 million to Police Scotland and ensure the free bus travel for young people is delivered. The Scottish budget will also benefit most families across Scotland. Firstly, our council tax rates are substantially lower than south of the border, where currently a Band D property in England pays on average £1,750, and across Scotland the same band is on average £1,251. Here in Edinburgh, a Band D property is £1,277, an average saving of £473 per household. Presiding Officer, the council tax and income tax savings combined ensure that for the majority of people in Scotland, the claim by others in this chamber that Scotland is the highest tax part of the UK is utter nonsense. Secondly, the Scottish Government's proposal to introduce a £10 per week Scottish Child payment by Christmas for low-income families with children under 6 will help lift 30,000 children out of poverty. This is only This is only the beginning, as the Scottish Fiscal Commission forecast that by the time it is fully rolled out in 2023-24, at least 280,000 children will receive the Scottish Child Payment. When this benefit was first discussed, churches, trade unions, poverty academics and charities all agreed that at £5 per week it would make a huge difference. Well, this Scottish Government has doubled it to £10, and I would hope that other parties would support this move. Presiding Officer, Scotland is taking the right steps to provide a more progressive tax system, but let's not forget that we could do even more if we had certainty over the settlement from Westminster in advance of our own budget. I hope that the Tory UK Government will see sense and in future years set their budget at a more appropriate time in order that this Government can continue to provide with certainty the support and services that the people of Scotland need.
Dean Lockhart, followed by George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the budget statement, the Cabinet Secretary claimed that the SNP has introduced the most progressive, fair and balanced income tax system in the UK, and that the SNP's tax policies will help promote well-being in Scotland. Presiding Officer, both of these claims are simply untrue. With respect to income tax, Scottish taxpayers will, according to Spice, this year pay £650 million more in income tax than their counterparts elsewhere in the rest of the UK. Everyone earning over £27,000 paying more income tax, and this Scottish tax resolution today will entrench that tax gap and tax burden. And for those who supposedly pay less income tax in Scotland, which the SNP use as the basis for saying their system is fair, they pay 50 pence a week less in tax, an amount which has already been more than wiped out by increasing council tax under the SNP. And this SNP tax policy actually costs more to administer than it does to provide that saving of 50 pence a week. Presiding Officer, the reality is that the SNP have cynically manipulated the tax system in Scotland for the sake of a cheap political line. A line that the Cabinet Secretary and others, including Gordon MacDonald, repeats ad nauseum to say that the majority of taxpayers in Scotland pay less tax, when the reality is that overall Scottish taxpayers are paying £650 million more a year than their counterparts in the rest of the UK. And I will give way to the Cabinet Secretary, who I would like to explain why, according to Spice, Scottish taxpayers are overall paying more than £650 million a year than their counterparts in the rest of the UK.
Kate Forbes.
Very simple question. It's when you take into account the behavioural impacts of adopting Conservative tax policies, there would be even less to the tune of £460 million available to spend. What would he cut?
Dean Lockhart.
According to the Fraser-Vallender, there would be no need for increased tax in Scotland if the economy was growing faster than it is right now. So the simple answer, the Cabinet Secretary keeps asking us what would be cut or what tax would be raised. We would grow the economy, Cabinet Secretary, and that is what you're incapable of doing. But, President Officer, the truly remarkable fact is that despite this £650 million more of higher taxes imposed by the SNP, according to Fraser-Vallender, virtually no extra money is being raised to spend on public services. In the words of the Fraser-Vallender, higher tax in Scotland is being cancelled out by lower wage growth. Not my words, the words of the Fraser-Vallender. So there we have it, the hard-working people of Scotland paying more tax, seeing a reduction in their take-home pay, not to fund extra public spending, but to subsidise the economic failures of the SNP. And that's why one of our budget red lines was for there to be no further increase in the income tax gap between Scotland and the rest of the UK, not just because higher tax is bad for the economy. And we're seeing that in response to something raised by Willie Rennie. We continue to see the Scottish economy growing at less than half the rate of the rest of the UK, and the SFC is forecasting that for the next 4 years. But also because higher tax is unfair and regressive for the people of Scotland to be paying more just to subsidise the cost overruns we're seeing under the SNP on ferries, on hospitals and on roads. Presiding Officer, let me turn to the other so-called policy objective underlying the budget and the SNP's tax policy, the promotion of well-being, mentioned by the Minister in his opening remarks. Last month, Nicola Sturgeon announced that the goal and objective of all economic policy should be well-being, which is at the very heart of our economic strategy. Unfortunately, just hours after making this statement, it was revealed that Scotland's ranking in the international wellbeing tables had suffered the biggest ever decline of any country, with Scotland declining from 16th place to 22nd place in the international rankings, now meaning we are at the bottom half of wellbeing rankings for developed nations. This decline was a result of declining education standards, relative economic decline and reduced life expectancy. So instead of spinning a line that this SNP government has promoted Scotland's well-being, the Cabinet Secretary and the Minister should recognise that Scotland's rapid decline in international well-being tables is in reality a savage indictment of their government's 13 years of failure in all areas of government. And for these reasons, Presiding Officer, we will be voting against the rate resolution at decision time.
George Adam, followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I'm delighted to speak in this debate today, because who doesn't want to listen to the Tories talk nonsense about tax for an hour and a half of their life? Who doesn't want to spend that hour and a half listening to that nonsense? Honestly, it's why I get up in the morning, Presiding Officer. But what I am proud of, I'm proud to stand up and advocate once again for a progressive tax system here in Scotland. Under today's proposed rates proposal, Scotland will remain the lowest tax part of the UK for the third year in a row. And I'm repeating things that my colleagues have already said, because I think some in here need to hear this again. With 56% of our taxpayers paying less than they would if they'd lived elsewhere in the UK. Now, Presiding Officer, no, I've heard enough of your nonsense. In these uncertain times, increased Tory austerity and no clarity coming from Boris Johnson and his cronies in Westminster, it is a relief to many Scots in my constituency, and I'm sure, Presiding Officer, across the nation, to know that they're going to be treated fairly by their government here in Scotland. Despite suggestions to the contrary from the opposition, on their current salary, no Scottish income taxpayer will pay more than 2021 than they do today under our proposals, unlike our Westminster counterparts, who are quite happy to penalise low-income families, simply doing all they can to make ends meet to give tax breaks to the richest in society. The system in Scotland is vastly different. It's based on fairness, dignity and respect. And the SNP wants to support our citizens and make this country a better place for everyone to thrive and live in. The SNP government's decision on taxation have resulted in a more progressive tax system which protects lower and middle income earners while raising additional revenue to support our economy and invest in delivering the widest range of free to access public services anywhere in these islands. When you're looking at these rate proposals, it's vitally important to consider all the services available to us here in Scotland that would not be accessed to elsewhere. Prescriptions, higher education, baby boxes, for example, are all enormously beneficial and life-changing initiatives, and are things every Scot can take advantage regardless of their financial situation. The Tories also like to create misconceptions around the higher rate threshold freeze and suggest that middle-income taxpayers have been targeted unfairly. Presiding Officer, the average taxpayer income in Scotland in 2018-19 was estimated to be £24,000 per year, so any notion that the tax policy of freezing HRT is impacting the middle classes is untrue and misleading. The higher rate threshold freeze only affects people earning over £43,430, which in real terms is around 16% of the Scottish taxpayers in 2020-21. Presiding Officer, ultimately, the rates proposal today, along with the budget that puts people firmly at the heart of this equation, renews our social contract with the people of Scotland. Scottish taxpayers continue to have access to a wider and better funded set of free-to-access public services than anywhere else in the United Kingdom. Scotland is the best place to live, work and do business. Businesses benefit from our investment in infrastructure, broadband, research and development, business rate support, investments in skills and training. But above all, the social contract the SNP has made with the people of Scotland continues to be upheld after 13 years in government. Presiding Officer,
as Paisley's MSP, and as you all know, it's a job that I love to do day in, day out, I'm tired of seeing many of my constituents needlessly struggling at the hands of the Conservative Party, using food banks to feed their children, having to decide between a hot meal or a hot home, and just generally struggling day to day to make ends meet. That is why it's vital that we protect the low and middle income earners in our society and continue to ensure the majority of Scots have the best deal in the United Kingdom.
The last of the open debate contributions is from Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I want to just pick up on a few things that other members have raised in the debate, and I'll chronologically go through them. So let me start with Donald Cameron. I don't think he seems to be here to hear me, but I'm sure he'll be listening somewhere. I thought it was exceptionally brave of him to raise the issue of council tax, given that the average household council tax in England is £429 higher than the average Band-D council tax is in Scotland. So he gets full marks for bravery, perhaps a few odd bonus marks for effrontery. Now, Rhoda Grant seemed to suggest, but I'm going to consult the official report later because I can't really believe it, that I'm actually paying less tax than I used to under the Scottish proposals. Well, I've actually gone into my database and I've got my tax returns out, and I find I'm now paying, various sources of income, I'm now paying £2,051 more per annum than previously, and I am happy so to do, as so many people with social conscience in Scotland would be. She also criticises the relationship in the Scottish Government, the SNP Government and councils. One of the key things we did in 2007, we came in and found the Labour Party had left us with 25% of the money that councils got was ring-fenced. We cut that dramatically. It's crept up a wee bit subsequently, but councils have a freedom which they very much welcome. But Willie Rennie, the man who never takes an intervention because he knows it'll hurt too much, criticising capital spending. Well, when they came to me as government minister on the fourth replacement crossing, the budget was £3.4 to £4.3 billion. When it went into the European Journal for bids, the top was £2.3 billion and the floor was £1.9 billion. What did we actually build it for? Less than £1.4 billion. £500 million below the budget. So Willie Rennie, as a Fife MSP, should tack tent. Now, Alexander Burnett is so much, I'm not sure I've got time. Let's just start with one of the crippling things that the Tories have done for local authorities across the UK, which is to double the Public Works Loan Board interest rate. How's that going to help councils across the UK? Simply to tackle a couple of councils in England's abuse of the borrowing powers to put into commercial investments. Well, you could have dealt with this in another way. Now, I've also looked at the Audit Scotland report on Aberdeenshire, because he criticised the position of Aberdeenshire. Well, in the 2019 report from Audit Scotland, the period 2013-14 to 2018-19, Aberdeenshire did extremely well in improving their position over that period. Only West Lothian and Mid Lothian did better. And the other council I've got the privilege to represent, which is Murray, was next up. So this government is undoing the historic wrongs that have been in council funding, and you'll get it on page 19 of the Audit Scotland report. It's worth perhaps reminding us, as I approach the 4 minutes, that this whole issue of income tax is a fascinating one. Because, of course, when did income tax start? And the answer is 1798. And who introduced that income tax? William Pitt the Younger, a Tory.
We now move to the closing speakers. And I call Alex Rowley, please, for around 5 minutes.
Presiding Officer, I think we've had quite a good debate today, and there's been some really interesting points made. One of the issues that I would say is that we need to try, I think, and encourage a wider discussion within communities across Scotland about what kind of Scotland we want to see in the future and how do we pay for that. Because the idea, I mean, it is those on the Tory benches often object to taxes being paid, they support austerity, and they complain when public services are cut. But that doesn't round itself because you can't have all these things. And so there is a need to have a cordial discussion and debate. And I was surprised at George Adam. I hope when he looks back and reflects on that, if we're going to encourage a discussion within the public, then if we come in here and call each other names and accuse each other of talking nonsense, then it's hardly surprising that we have the kind of debate that we have on social media and we're not able to have a cordial discussion. So how we discuss these issues, I think, is very important. A lot's been said today about behavioural change, and I know that's the argument that the SNP government make as to why, as Rhoda Grant said last year, we saw the SNP introduce a rates resolution that gave higher earners a tax cut, but increased tax to some lower earners. Behavioural change that worries me is the behavioural change that we've seen where working people used to be getting their wages and be able to go and buy their shopping are now being forced into going to food banks. And that issue needs to be addressed within these discussions. Sarah Boyack mentioned Citizens Advice Scotland, and I got a letter just before I came in here from Mrs Sandy Watts, the Chief Executive of Citizens Advice at Perth and Kinross. And she says, in the last year, the biggest debt issue across Scottish Citizens Advice network was council tax debt. In total, the people who turned to Citizens Advice network in Scotland for help with council tax debt owed a combined £6.9 million, or on average £3,000 a person. Now, we've got to surely be concerned about that. We should be talking to COSLA and local government, as well as certainly joining with Citizen Advice and trying to raise awareness of the benefits that are there.
Claire Adamson.
Would the member not agree that part of the problem around council tax debt is the absolutely chaotic rollout of universal credit, which, with people having to wait 5 weeks for payment, means that they're automatically going into council tax debt almost immediately, and it's that kind of pressure on poorer families that is causing so much of the upset that we feel in these benches when it comes to this issue?
Alex Rowley.
I mean, welfare reform has had a dreadful impact on communities right across Scotland. I wouldn't disagree with that. But it's interesting that the numbers of people who are in work and are in poverty has continued to grow. So there's a wider issue there around the economy and the kind of economy that we want to see. And that's where I do agree with the point made for the Tory benches. We shouldn't just look at tax from the point of view how much can we tax people. We have to grow our economy. And the more we grow our economy, the more income tax that we will be able to bring in, as well as other forms of taxation. And I raised this with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance at the committee this morning. I'm not sure that the budget is linked to a clear policy direction that will deliver and grow our economy. And if we are to succeed as a country moving forward, we have to put in place a budget that will link to growing our economy. Can I say the fiscal framework? Why did John Swinney sign up to that fiscal framework? Was the civil servants advising them at that time that that was not the best way forward for Scotland? I do think we need to look at that, because this fiscal framework is turning out to be a disaster, and Murdo Fraser makes a good point when he questions that.
Very quickly, please.
We all signed up to the fiscal framework in good faith, but the fact that there was a review baked in indicates that it would need to be reviewed at one point. Would the Labour Party join with us and others, hopefully in the Chamber, for calling for an early review in order to protect Scottish taxpayers?
Alec Rowley.
Absolutely. We certainly need to get a review going and look at how we're going to move that forward. Patrick Harvey talked about the manifestos and the fact that manifestos will come forward. Every political party, I look forward, because every political party needs to start to set out how we're going to move forward. It's one thing to blame Westminster, but there are powers in Scotland. If we want to be ambitious for Scotland, then let's have that discussion and that debate around Scotland about what kind of society we want to see and how we pay for it. Thank you.
Call Murdo Fraser. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, I don't think this has been the most informative of debates this afternoon, although it's sometimes been lively enough. But can I start in a consensual manner by congratulating Ben Macpherson on leading his first debate in his new role as Minister for Public Finance. It was, of course, a position used by his predecessor as a springboard to greater things. So we will look forward to watching Mr Macpherson's career with interest. Now, my colleague David Cameron set out at the start of the debate that the Scottish Conservatives cannot support the rate resolution this afternoon. Sorry, I was confusing my two esteemed Camerons. Donald Cameron, Presiding Officer. I'm sure Donald Cameron will make an excellent Prime Minister when the time comes. He's agreeing with that. It's good to see. Now, we recognise that what is being proposed in this resolution will not, in itself, widen the tax differential between Scotland and the rest of the UK. And we do not know, and this point was made fairly earlier in the debate, we do not know what will be in the Chancellor's budget next week, setting out tax rates for the rest of the UK. It is expected there might not be a change in the thresholds for the higher and additional rates, and if that is indeed the case, then the tax differential will not widen, and we'll have to wait and see if that is the case. Now, what we did ask, as Donald Cameron reminded us, as part of our budget discussions, was for the Scottish Government to undertake, if there were tax changes in the UK budget that widen the differential, these would be mirrored in Scotland with a subsequent amendment to the rate resolution. And the Finance Secretary decided not to go down that route, as was her right. But it is an issue that mattered, and it still does matter, Presiding Officer. And it is important to clarify the matching UK income tax changes comes at no cost to the Scottish Government, because under the fiscal framework, the Scottish budget is compensated for mirroring those amendments. So there was no downside to the Scottish budget from going down the route that we proposed. Our view is that a tax differential between Scotland and the rest of the UK does have a negative impact. It does send out a message that Scotland is the highest tax part of the United Kingdom. For anyone earning above £27,000, that means paying more taxes than their counterparts elsewhere in the UK, in some cases substantially more. For somebody earning £50,000, they will now pay more than £1,500 extra in tax than their counterparts south of the border. And this is an approach to taxation which has caused real concern amongst the business community, particularly those trying to recruit talented, mobile people to fill roles in Scotland. Because not just is income tax higher for above-average earners, but I'll go away in a second, LBTT rates are higher for larger properties. I'll go away to Mr Allen.
Alistair Allen.
I thank the member for giving way. I've listened with care to some of the language which he and his colleagues have been using. He mentions the concern he has that talented people on £50,000 will be deterred by the government's tax measures. Does it ever occur to him that people who earn rather less than £50,000 may be talented too?
Murdo Fraser.
Well, of course we have talented people earning less than £50,000, but the most they're going to gain from the SNP's tax benefits is 40 pence a week. That's not going to attract people to come to Scotland, Presiding Officer, and we have to look at the downside as well as the upside. And of course this has an impact not just on the private sector, but also on the public sector, where in areas such as the NHS, where we have large numbers of highly paid medical staff who have a choice of working anywhere in the UK, will consider the whole question of the tax they pay as a factor in determining where they take up roles. Now, we hear from the SNP benches, we heard it this afternoon, these additional taxes are justified because they support extra spending. This is the point Gordon MacDonald made. Benefits such as free personal care, free university tuition and free prescriptions are available in Scotland and all England, and there's a trade-off between higher taxes and better public services, and people are happy to pay more if they get more back in return. And the problem with that argument is it's not supported by the facts, because according to analysis done by Spice, the Scottish Government's decision not to replicate tax policy that applies in the rest of the UK means revenues should be around £650 million higher than would otherwise be the case before taking account of any behavioural changes. But as I pointed out to the Minister earlier, and as Dean Lockhart reminded us, the net impact of these tax changes is not an additional £650 million, or even £600 million, or even £500 million, or even £100 million, Mr Lyle. It is a mere £46 million, less than 1/10 of the total figure raised in taxation. Yes, I'll give way.
Ben McPherson.
Yes, I'll give way.
Ben McPherson.
I thank Mr Fraser for giving way on that point. With respect, I would just want to make clear that the Spice report is clear that it does not include, given that's been a topic of Mr Fraser's summing up. And this caveat is important because our analysis shows that when behavioural change is taken into account, the figure is actually close to 460 million, not 46 million.
Well, I think I'll pay more attention to the Spice analysis than to the government analysis if the Minister will forgive me. Now, of course, the reason for this differential is the slower growth in earnings and, in consequence, tax revenues in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK. And in terms of the fiscal framework, this means the block grant adjustment reduces the Scottish budget. So Scottish taxpayers are paying £650 million more than our counterparts south of the border, and yet the actual income being generated accounts to less than 1/10 of the total being paid. Put in another way, if the Scottish economy and Scottish earnings grew at the same rate as the UK average, there would be no need for any additional tax bills in Scotland. We'd raise the same amount of money from existing taxpayers. The SNP's tax grab is only just helping us stand still. So, Presiding Officer, just to close, there's much more I could say if I had more time, but let me just say in closing. Donald Cameron reminded us of the SNP's promise not to increase the basic rate of tax, a promise now broken on 3 occasions and broken again today, this afternoon, if Parliament passes this rate resolution. Presiding Officer, it is our ambition to see a reduction in the divergence in tax rates between Scotland and the rest of the UK. The rates resolution today does not achieve that. It perpetuates a situation where Scottish taxpayers are asked to pay more but are getting less in return. And for these reasons, we must oppose the motion today. Thank you.
I now call on Ben McPherson to wind up in this debate. Up to 8 minutes, please, certainly no later than 4:10. Please, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to all members who've contributed to this important debate. I think it has been a generally constructive discussion on how together we balance the requirements for all of us to act on behalf of our constituents to enhance social justice while also creating and supporting the growth of an inclusive and sustainable economy. And bearing in mind that our constituents are with us as part of this debate on how together we can be proud to make contributions from our income for the common good of Scotland. There were many points raised, but I think some important ones, first of all, to point out would be Patrick Harvey in a very, I thought, nuanced and important speech made the clear point at the beginning that because of the arrangement of the 2016 Scotland Act, if we do not pass this rate resolution today, the consequences could be catastrophic, to use your words. And I thank you for pointing out that serious issue to remind us all of the significance of today. And thank you for the speech and the many important points you made. I also... I'll give way to John Mason. Bill, Bruce.
That'll be Bruce Crawford.
I'm actually quite alarmed right now to be compared with John Mason, but my good friend John. But I just wonder if the Minister would confirm for me, given the contribution that Murdo Fraser just made to the debate, how much money that this Parliament and its budget would be lessened by had we followed the Tories' tax plans and actually gone in their direction?
Ben Macpherson.
Thank you, Bruce Crawford, for that important question. Our analysis is that if we had reverted to our UK income tax policy, we would be £460 million less in revenue for supporting public services and our economy. And of course, that is part of investment. Yes, Murdo Fraser, briefly.
Murdo Fraser.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way. Just on the comment he made a moment ago in relation to Patrick Harvey's contribution, can you just confirm that the loss of £12 billion to the Scottish public finances would be, as he said, catastrophic?
Ben Macpherson.
If we don't pass this resolution today in order to action the income tax powers, then that loss of £12 billion in terms of the take of income tax would mean that we wouldn't be able to invest that money in Scottish public services. And of course, that investment goes towards some of the many benefits that a number of members mentioned, whether it was George Adam talking about the baby box or Gordon MacDonald talking about the Scottish Child Payment and the impact that will make, whether it's about the abolition of tuition fees, which saves £27,000 per student, whether it's free personal care for the elderly, free school meals for children P1 to P3, no prescription charges, concessionary travel, around about 60,000 homes for social rent in Scotland since 2007. The list could go on, and all of these have made a significant impact. Of course, it's important to remember as well. Yes, Patrick Harvey.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank the Minister for letting me join in on the interventions. And I agree that many of the spending policies that are made possible by more progressive tax do disproportionately benefit lower earners, people more in need. But does the Minister accept that we're only going to have an overall progressive tax system if we do follow through with the commitment to replace the regressive council tax, and the Scottish Government and the SNP have to come forward with a proactive position on how they want to see that happen if we're going to make progress?
Ben Macpherson.
I thank Patrick Harvey for that important point, and I enjoyed taking part in those discussions for the first time with him and colleagues just last week. And we, in the undertaking that we gave last year in this process, I look forward to constructively taking those discussions forward, because they are very important discussions. And within that arrangement, I think it's important, as well as the list I gave, just some of the benefits that these income tax commitments and the revenue raised will allow us to undertake and have allowed us to undertake. I think it's important to also emphasise that, unfortunately, we are also having to spend £110 million to mitigate against UK government welfare reform, and it's important to remember that. Dealing with another aspect that was raised in particular by the Conservative front bench, and indeed all of the Conservative front bench, made an analysis, I think, erroneously, that the income tax situation we have in Scotland is having a behavioural change impact in terms of attractiveness. I would want to point out to the Conservatives that Scotland, of course, has a very strong reputation and very strong record on attracting inward investment, and that net migration from both out with and, crucially, within the UK is positive for Scotland. That means more people coming from the rest of the UK to Scotland than going to the rest of the UK. And much of that is because of the high-quality public services provided and the socially just, progressive, competitive economy that we're building. And actually, the biggest threat to Scotland's attractiveness is, of course, the Conservatives' immigration proposals from the UK government. And indeed, the only time, the most significant time when we have seen, to use Alexander Burnett's phrase, a brain drain from Scotland was during the 1980s. And we know who was in government at that point. It was the Conservative government at Westminster, and the really negative effect their policies had on Scotland's economy and society. So, moving on, I think that there has been some really important points made about the quality of our debate and about the way we have to be nuanced in this. Tom Arthur, I thought, made a fine contribution on those points, as did a number of others. And also setting income tax consideration and policy within the wider scenario and within wider considerations, whether it's its relationship with national insurance, which John Mason talked about, but also its relationship with dividend income tax and savings income tax, and how we need to consider all of that, as well as employment law and welfare policy and immigration policy and the other suite of taxes that are reserved in terms of our considerations around how we make these decisions on what rates to set. And that has been important thus far and is important again today, because since 2016, when we have had the ability to set income tax rates, we have had to do this responsively and progressively, on principle, yes, but also on logic, and in response to matters beyond our control, externalities like most prominently Brexit, for example. Members, today is our opportunity to use the limited powers of this Parliament as best and as responsibly as we can to continue to build a fairer and more progressive country. And for income tax, Scotland, and it's important to emphasise this, remains the lowest tax part of the UK. Contrary to what some may say, it is the lowest part of the UK in terms of income tax for the third consecutive year. The proposals put forward today mean that 56% of Scottish income taxpayers will pay less income tax in 2021 than they would if they lived elsewhere in the UK. No Scottish income taxpayer will pay more income tax next year on their current income than they do now. And our budget sets out tax plans to protect the lowest and middle earning taxpayers and make the tax system fairer and more progressive. We have chosen, as I said in my opening remarks, to freeze the higher rate threshold in 2020-21, which the Independent Fiscal Commission forecast will raise £51 million next year for investment in public services. So not doing so would mean there would be £51 million less to support our vital public services, invest in our economy, tackle climate change and meet our ambitious targets on child poverty. We have asked those that can afford it most to pay a bit more, and this means that we can deliver a wider and better funded set of free-to-access public services which are not available elsewhere in the UK. Presiding Officer, I could say a lot more, and I'm thankful to all members for this important debate. We in the Scottish Government take seriously the responsibility of government to create a tax system with the powers we have that is right for Scotland, right for its people, its businesses and the economy. And I ask Parliament this afternoon to share in that responsibility and pass this Scottish rate resolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. That concludes our debate on the Scottish rate resolution. Now, before I put the question, I would advise members that under Rule 9.16.7, Stage 3 proceedings on the budget cannot begin unless the Scottish rate resolution is agreed to. So the question is that motion 21090 in the name of Ben Macpherson on the Scottish rate resolution is agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. Now we're going to move to a vote, but because members aren't here, I'm going to suspend for 5 minutes to call members to the chamber. So Parliament is suspended for 5 minutes.